Hello and welcome back to Scale Down Customs. Today on the bench, I'm going to be building the Revell Porsche 911, the 934 RSR in the Jagermeister livery. So let's open her up and see what we got. I really like the way Revell has been doing their instructions lately with the color instruction booklet. It just makes assembly a little bit easier when you're trying to figure out which part goes where. Decals look very clean, very sharp, very crisp detail. I'm liking that. Tires are nicely molded, a couple little blemishes there, but we can use the other side. Of course, you have the mold line in the middle, which we're going to sand out anyway. Those are nice looking tires. Kit chrome looks really good. On most of the kits, I actually strip most of the kit chrome off and re-chrome it up the way I like. But this actually looks really good. The headlight buckets I will leave. The rims, those look really good, so I might be leaving some of that. Engine detail looks really good. Some cross-drilled rotors for the brakes. Interior looks good, nice and crisp. Kind of got the bare stripped down interior for the race car. Nice high back racing seat. Some nice details on this. Dashboard, roll cage, window netting, very basic stripped down door cards, and the body and the chassis. Again, just some, it's very basic, but it's very clean and crisp. Good detail. And the body, as you can see, it is molded in the orange. I am going to be priming over this and painting. I am going to build this box stock, so it will be orange, but I will be priming and then repainting it orange. Some of the under hood details molded in. Makes painting it a little bit more difficult, but we'll make it work. Body itself, nice and solid. Feels a little thicker, so not really any worry of it coming out crooked or wobbling. Mold lines are very minimal. They'll come off nice and easily. I'll be scribing some of these panel lines out a little bit deeper, but that's looking really good. A little bit of flashing on the edges, but again, it's pretty common with plastic molded kits, so nothing to worry about. It's just part of building a model. That looks really good. Glass parts are very clean and shiny. Those headlight lenses are amazing. Those look really good. Actually, those aren't the headlight lenses. Those are the headlight lenses. Oh, that glass looks really good. I'm going to put it back in the plastic just to keep it as scratchless as possible. All right, let's get to building. So first things first, I'm going to take care of the mold lines, get the body ready for primer and paint. All right, while everything is still on the sprues, I'm gonna go get these things washed off in the sink just to clean off any possible release agent that might be left over from the molding process. So I'm gonna go get these cleaned off and be right back. All right, so for sanding, I'm just gonna be using mostly my Tamiya 600 grit sanding sponge and then just some sanding sticks, some nail files of different grits. And for panel line scribing, I'll just be using my Tamiya panel line scribing tool. I think this is the 0.2 blade, if I'm not mistaken. Alright, so those panel lines were actually really shallow. I started sanding and I sanded right through the panel line, which I had to kind of re-scribe that, which is always tough to do to get a straight line. When they're this shallow, just if you're going to scribe them, just go really light pressure, because I skipped off a couple of times and I scraped into the body. And I did that because I wanted to show you guys how to fix that. So let's do that right now. So to fix that, I'm just going to be using my Mr. Hobby Mr. Surface 500. That's getting pretty thick. It's drying out a little bit. But so what we're going to do is we're just going to paint some primer. That's getting too thick, but we'll try it. And we're just going to fill in those scrapes anywhere that the panel line scribing tool has skipped off and scraped up into the body where we don't want it. We're going to fill those in with some primer. Once this dries up, you might have to, you can see it's already kind of sinking into that one, so you might have to add a couple coats, which is fine. And if we happen to get some in our actual panel line while it's still wet, we can just rescribe it, taking the primer out of where we don't want it to be. All right, so we'll let that set up and we'll keep moving with body prep. So I got all the ejection pin marks, the sinkholes, and my mistakes, teaching examples, fixed, filled in, and sanded down. So I think we're ready for some primer. So for my primer, I'll probably mostly be using the Stynylrez, the water-based primers through the airbrush, and then for maybe the chassis for speed effect, I'll probably use the Mr. Surface 1000 out of the rattle can. I'm actually pretty happy with this stuff. So the reason I'm not going to use this on the body is because I have a lot of detail that I have to get into in here, and I know if I try to hit that with a rattle can, I'm just going to blast way too much on there. So let's go spray some primer. All right, so we got the primer sprayed on there. Of course, this was the Stynylrez that I used on the body. And the Stynylrez, like I said, it's a water-based primer. It's airbrush ready, goes straight in the airbrush, right on the car, and it goes on really well. It's really forgiving stuff. You can put it on really heavy, and it still tends to flatten out really nicely. There's a little bit more texture to it, so it would be recommended to wet sand this out after it dries. And then for the chassis, again, I use the Mr. Surface 1000 right from the rattle can, and I have really been impressed with this stuff lately. Sometimes I tend to go way too heavy with the rattle can sprays because I can't regulate it as much. But as you can see, that just goes on really nicely. And I just kind of went over it several light coats, and been pretty impressed with that rattle can primers from Mr. Hobby. So I'll probably be using those a little bit more. And this goes on really, really smooth. Some of this stuff you might not, like on the chassis, I'm not even going to wet sand this because it's just so smooth right from the initial application. Anyway, so that's a little bit about primers. So to wet sand this down, I'm going to be using a couple of different things. I'll just use some wet dry sandpaper. This is a 3000 grit, and then a sanding sponge from Tamiya, again 3000 grit. I like the sanding sponges because they can kind of conform to these a little bit more curved edges a little more easily, and these kind of tend to burn through corners pretty quickly, so I'll be using a little bit of both. So for my initial application with the primer, I am going to burn through the primer down to the plastic in a couple spots, probably over most of the car, because I'm looking for high-low spots. You can also do this by doing 2 different coats of primer, so maybe a light gray and then a dark gray, white, black, white, gray, whatever, just 2 different color separations so that you can use the second coat as a guide coat. So I'll be sanding this down. I'll be looking for some high-low spots. You can see right there. That's burning through really quickly. Around the edges is generally where you get high spots really quickly from the mold process. So I already know there's some low spots here that I had to fill in, so I'm going to pay a little extra attention to these spots, and I'll be sanding those down to the plastic again just to check for consistency and smoothness on the body, to see if I need to refill in some spots and level some stuff out. Alright, so here you can see what I'm talking about with the high and low spots with just the primer. Initially it looks pretty flat, but until you actually get sanding it down smooth, now you can really see what I'm talking about with the high and low spots in the mold, in the plastic itself. So, and to correct something like this isn't something that you're going to need to use body filler to level that out. Just sanding this down with allowing the primer to stay in those low spots is going to be good enough to get it really, really level. If you wanted to, and sometimes I'll do this too, take a flat sanding item, emery board, nail file, sanding stick, anything like that, that's not going to bend and move like this. That way you'll get a really, really flat sand across the flat surfaces that you want smooth. Alright, got all the parts wet sanded down, smoothed out, all the edges smoothed off. So we're ready for another coat of primer. Probably what I'm going to try this time is, I'm out of the rattle can primer, so I'm going to try the Mr. Surface 1000 bottle primer. I'm going to thin this down. Not really sure yet, maybe a 1-to-1. I'll have to play with the consistency, I'm not sure on that, but I think I'm going to try to airbrush the bottle primer, so we'll see how that goes. Alright, so we got that second coat of primer on there, the Mr. Surface 1000. I thinned it 1-to-1 and it went on really nicely, so I just really love the solvent-based products, the primers, things like that. They just go on so nice and so smooth. The Stynylrez is a good option for if you need a water-based primer, if you're in an apartment or spraying inside your house and you can't have the solvent smells or whatever. The Stynylrez is a really good option for the water-based primers. Alright, so I'm going to wet sand this down again. This time I don't want to burn through the primer. I only want to smoothen the primer in preparation for paint. So same process again, 3000 grit. So I'm not going to show you guys that again because it's the same process. So I'm going to go ahead and get this wet sanded and ready for paint. Alright, so wet sanded down again, ready for some paint. For the paint I'm going to be using the AK Orange. I haven't used this before. I believe this is a lacquer based paint, so I'm going to be using a lacquer thinner to thin this down. So we'll see how this goes on. Alright, so the AK paint went on pretty well. I thinned it 1-to-1 with just some Tamiya lacquer thinner, and I think I sprayed it on way too thick. So it's usually a good idea to test out any new products that you get on spoons or whatever else before you start putting it on your model. I decided not to do that, and I am regretting it. First of all, it's a really flat paint, as you can see, so I wasn't expecting that. No fault of the paint. The paint went on really well. It covered really nicely, but I think I put it on too thick. And so it built up and dried as it was spraying in a couple spots, so it's a little rough. The roof is nice and smooth. That's pretty much perfect, but the rest of the body is a little rough. The color is perfect though. Anyway, so I could try to wet sand it back down, but there's just some dried spots up in the corners and stuff, so I'm gonna end up stripping this whole thing off and starting over with paint applications. So I'll be using my trusty isopropyl alcohol bath, and we'll get this stripped down and figure out what we're going to do for paint next. Alright, so we got her stripped back down. So the parts that I had the water base Stynylrez primer, the isopropyl alcohol took everything off right down to the plastic in a matter of a couple of hours. The body parts that I had sanded took a little bit longer, but the water-based primers, everything on top of that, the paint, everything just comes right off. With the solvent-based primers, so the Mr. Surface primers, on the body especially where I had it sanded, it did not come off just by the soak alone. So I ended up having to, after overnight, the solvent-based primer was still stuck to the body, so I had to help it off a little bit more with some 800 grit wet dry sandpaper, and I just basically wet sanded it with the isopropyl solution. Anyway, so we got it all stripped back down again. So I've got a couple other, I got some sink marks that I need to, some ejection pin marks that I need to fill in again, and then a couple of sink marks to fill in again. So we'll get that body prepped and back ready for paint again, and then we'll go back to paint. All right, so while you guys weren't looking, I went ahead and stripped her down just using the isopropyl alcohol bath. Got her cleaned up and reprimed and sanded and ready for some paint once again. And I was talking to my friend Jameson, who owns scalefinishes.com, and he knew I was working on this car, and so he actually supplied me with some Jagermeister orange. So thanks, Jameson, for that. Again, scalefinishes.com. I'll put a link in the description below to his website. And just be aware, he is trying to redo his website, so that's coming along. He's got all sorts of factory colors for all kinds of makes and models, so it's worth checking that out. Now, I think some of these paints, they like a little bit heavier airbrush. I'm running the Iwata Eclipse HPCS, which is a 0.35 mil needle. But we're going to see if we can make this work without dusting up too much. I'll probably thin it down a little bit with Scale Finishes thinner as well, just to see if I can get that to flow a little bit nicer. But anyway, I think we're, once again, we're ready for some paint. So we'll go spray the Jagermeister orange from scalefinishes.com. So the scale finishes paint went on really nicely. I actually ended up over thinning it probably 3 to 1. So 3 parts paint, 1 part thinner. And I think that just helped it flow a lot smoother out of my smaller airbrush and not allowing the paint to dry so quickly. But that went on really nicely. I'm pretty happy with that. So I actually did 4 light coats with the airbrush. I think one of my problems is I blasted on too heavy and I try to build it up too quickly. So with the airbrushes, some lighter coats and just kind of build it up is always a better option with the airbrush. But anyway, pretty happy with that. So that'll do it for this video. Stay tuned for part 2. Thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you on the next one.